Hi, and welcome to the Trauma-Informed Prosecutor. This is part of AEquitas's series on the foundations of sexual violence prosecutions. AEquitas is a federally funded organization. This series is actually supported through our funding from the Office on Violence Against Women. And we're really here to help the field by providing innovative, informed, and hopefully really practical strategies that you can apply to your work right away. We do that through resources such as this recorded a series of conversations with experts, webinars, articles, all available on our website. But we also are available for office or regional trainings, for one-on-one consultations. Probably my favorite thing to do, helping out on specific cases with developing a strategy or acting as a soundboard. And then we're also involved in several federally funded partnerships and initiatives. Maybe most importantly in our work on sexual violence cases is our partnership with the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. And we're lucky enough today to be with the lead attorney advisor on that initiative, Patti Powers. I'll give her a moment to introduce herself in a sec. To learn more about our resources or to check them out, please go to our website or follow us on any of these social media platforms. We're constantly pushing out new training opportunities, new resources that will hopefully help you maintain, sort of getting to know what the latest and greatest information is for the work that you're doing, really importantly. This is, of course, our support from the Office of Violence Against Women. We want to thank them for really the way that they have supported AEquitas since the beginning, and especially when we're trying to do new things to get this information to the field like this series. As we do kind of bring you the latest and greatest, sometimes we're sharing information from other resources like research and social science, and we do that using the fair use doctrine. Okay, so let's get started, Patti. First off, if you'll just take a second to introduce yourself and let the folks know you can't tell them all of your experience because that would be our entire time here, but maybe a little bit.
Thank you, Jane. And I'm really excited to be here with you today and discuss a really important topic. Just by way of a brief introduction, prior to joining my colleagues at AEquitas, I was a senior deputy prosecutor in Washington State, where I had the privilege to serve in that capacity for 27 years. I supervised our sexual assault and domestic violence unit 3 different times during my tenure, and focused primarily on sexual assault, domestic violence, crimes against children, and related homicides. Although I supervised our unit, I spent most of my time in trial, and I learned so much from our fellow citizens who are selected and who serve as jurors. And that's part of what I'll be sharing with you today. While I was still a prosecutor on vacation time, I was appointed as an HQE, a highly qualified expert for the United States military in the investigative division, and had the chance to consult on sexual assault and domestic violence cases, as well as provide training both at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri and also in Germany.
Oh, that's so cool, Patti. So what we're going to do today, hopefully during the course of our conversation, is first realizing that as as a prosecutor that is handling cases of sexual violence and related cases, it's really important for us to know and be able to recognize trauma and its effects so that we can make the appropriate decisions, and also that we can educate others, namely our judges and juries. And then we want to be thinking about how we, as part of a holistic, coordinated effort, can implement trauma-informed practices that ultimately will help us with having a victim that's able to participate should we go to trial on a sexual assault case. And a lot of that is going to be, how do we conduct our interviews? And then how do we take those same trauma-informed practices and apply them to the direct examinations that we may do in a trial? So we use that term trauma informed, and you may hear that a lot, but we never kind of dig into it. So Patty, I was hoping we could start with, what does it mean to you to be trauma informed, especially in the context of, the roles and responsibilities of a prosecutor?
Well, first and foremost, we have the privilege of working with and working for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. Victims are at the heart of the work that we do as prosecutors. And it's so important for us to be equipped and able to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma, to understand the context that that trauma occurred in. And part of that also involves focus on the offender and know how the offender inflicted trauma. And so when we put all of these components together, we are moving toward being trauma informed. And it's going to vary in different cases. But again, it's so critical to the work that we do as prosecutors.
Yeah, and I think of it as sort of two pieces. One is really we're going to be better serving victims and survivors in our community, and that's what we want to be doing when we understand trauma and sometimes complex and compound trauma. But it also is like helps us with our cases. There's a practical side of this as well. It's not just doing good. Hopefully, we're motivated by that, but it ends up having the collateral consequence of often improving how we understand the evidence that we're presented with in cases of sexual assault.
And that's a very important consideration also, Jane, in thinking about the victims that we're privileged to work with who have survived these violent crimes. We're able to recognize symptoms and signs of trauma. And in turn, that helps us to ultimately convey this evidence to a jury. What we ultimately want is to advance justice for victims of these crimes. And to do that, we have to put our cases together in such a way that jurors are going to be able to connect with the victim's experience of the crime. And it all begins with recognizing trauma.
Mhm. So let's think about what you said at the beginning, which is to understand the trauma, you really have to understand offender dynamics to a certain extent and how offenders inflict that trauma. So from the perspective of that offender focus, and then also understanding, the victim survivor and how to meet them where they are, can we talk a little bit about the impact of trauma and what we may be able to expect or at least be prepared for?
Sure. And when we talk about the importance of offender focus, there are certain aspects of it that can be very important to our consideration of how the victim was impacted by trauma. Is this an offender who was in a relationship or an acquaintance or otherwise known to the victim? And if that's the case, we're also dealing with a strong sense of betrayal, and in so many cases, actual shock. For many victims of sexual assault, regardless of the relationship or the acquaintance, at the moment of the sexual assault, that person is very much a stranger, much like the stranger, the unknown offender, who also assaults victims as well. So knowing the offender and how that offender chose the victim based upon being accessible, being vulnerable, and the offender's view of credibility, not our view of credibility, but how the offender thinks that a victim, for example, who consumes alcohol might be seen. But all of this becomes very important because this is going to impact the victim in very significant ways. And we really need to understand that, as well as the context of the crime, how the offender planned and premeditated, and in so many cases actually set the victim up to commit the crime. And the trauma that the victim presents with in our relationship with the victim as prosecutors really comes about because of all of those features. So what we really need to do, I think, is to take a deeper dive into all of that contextual evidence. And there is no blueprint. There's going to be very strong variation among victims in their response to trauma and different aspects of offender behavior. But the reality is trauma can affect every aspect of a victim's life. And it's so important for us to know that, because being a trauma-informed prosecutor isn't just based on one meeting with the victim, but it's based on the continuum of our work with the victim. It's a process. It takes time and it takes commitment.
Mhm. I was thinking about, the difference between acute trauma and maybe compound trauma and how that might look, but also how is it really impacting our case? And then how might we be able to explain that to a jury? So for example, instead of delayed disclosure being a sign that somebody, that this is not credible, framing it as the impact of trauma did not, that the offender, the defender's actions are responsible ultimately for defendant's actions, impact of the trauma, that actually explains maybe the delay in disclosure. And that actually explains why we might have some traumatic memories that we have to deal with, or the impact of trauma on memory, and then the impact of trauma on just being able to work with us. And, these cases sometimes can take a really long time. And to frame all of those things that may be coming to us initially as, okay, we're seeing these as challenges, to take what you said, which is sort of pull back and dive into the fact that these are offender caused trauma reactions.
Absolutely, Jane. And that's such a great example with delayed disclosure. In the past, there was concern about delayed disclosure in a case, that it might be problematic for a jury to understand. But we've come to know that delayed disclosure is part of the reality of the crime. So many victims are unable, due to fear of the offender or due to other features of their victimization, they're unable to make that disclosure. And so we turn back again to the point that we began with. The offender is accountable for victimization. It's the offender that inflicted trauma.
Yeah. So we kind of already touched on this, but the trauma and disclosure, that may be the primary reason for affecting the disclosure. It may also reoccur when we ask them questions and memories are accessed, and that may lead to disclosures that kind of come in layers over time, and maybe non-sequential memory disclosures. With this in mind, and disclosures, to steal your own phrase, Patti Powers, is the disclosure is the heartbeat of our case. And when we have trauma that's affecting that disclosure, how do we as prosecutors sort of first analyze it, assess it, and then make charging decisions based on it, and then also recreate that reality or explain that to a judge or jury?
Well, I agree that it's the heartbeat of our case, and we really need to consider all of the barriers and all of the obstacles that a victim needed to overcome to be able to make this disclosure. And again, how problematic can it be for a victim making a disclosure? So many victims that I was privileged to work with described to me, it was like stepping into floodlights. It's like a loss of privacy that was almost acute. And along with the loss of privacy becomes a fear of the offender returning. And so many victims also describe sexual assault as a crime that for them, it never ended. It began on a day and it ended on a certain day, but not really, because it really permeated every aspect of their life. And so when that disclosure is made, I think we can all truly respect that it's the heartbeat of the work that we do. And our work with victims doesn't, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a one-time meeting, but it is the process of building a relationship that we're privileged to have. Victims are really giving us an opportunity to advance justice. And when you think about this, it's so important as a trauma-informed prosecutor to recognize this. And victims may not be able to immediately disclose all of the information that we may hope for in order to further our case. But we also have learned that the more that we can help support the victim with the help of advocates and other allied professionals as well, the more likely it is that a victim is going to be able to achieve a comfort level, if you will, to be able to provide additional information if that's possible. And it may take time, it may take more than one interview. And when we conduct the interviews, we know that trauma is also going to surface because of the questions that we're asking, and that victims are being asked to go back to their experience of the crime. But with the proper support and with the insight that we can bring to this work as prosecutors, we can support the victim and help them to maintain their engagement in the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And we've got this sort of slide to demonstrate that maybe when we are meeting a victim where they're coming to our office, and we have that honor of speaking with them. And I just love how you frame that, because it really does put us in the position of being almost like in a position of privilege to be able to work these cases. And that, to me, is such a wonderful way to think about it. And especially when we're working with victims who not only come to us because of this acute trauma, this acute sexual trauma, but also many of the victims that we serve may have experienced other types of trauma throughout their lifetime. Everything from environmental and generational, and we could deep dive into all of these. But often we know from the research that victims of sexual violence have been victimized before. And the victims of sexual violence are often victimized in the course of an intimate partner violence relationship. And so you're really, and may have had prior, not great interactions with the criminal justice system. So they're working through that as well. And it's incumbent upon us in this position of privilege to address, or to at least acknowledge, all of this really complex trauma, and then how that translates into how they experience this crime that brings them to us.
Yes, I definitely agree, Jane. And although we're able as professionals to recognize certain commonalities of trauma and victimization, at the same time, we still need to bear in mind that these are highly individual responses as well. And what we're talking about now are many variables that can affect a number of different victims and really lead that victim to the experience of the crime that they have as caused by the offender. But it's so important for us to step back, not just to listen, but to truly hear when the victim provides that disclosure about their experience of the crime. And so many times, we're also going to receive information about prior victimization, perhaps as a child, perhaps earlier in adulthood. And we know from research, as well as our experience, that those who have suffered abuse at earlier times may be at more significant risk to be abused again. And the other thing to remember also is that, especially if there's a relationship or even an acquaintance with the offender, it's so likely that the offender knows this information and also senses the vulnerability of the victim and preys upon that vulnerability. So again, it takes us back to context and also the history of the victim, as well as the immediate, the acute trauma, as you described.
Mm-hmm. But I also want to kind of maybe address the fact that this idea of trauma, and we're learning so much more about it. There's some amazing research and some additional resources we have at the end of this presentation of work that you've been doing with Dr. Rebecca Campbell. We learn a lot more about trauma and its impacts, but I don't want us to think it's like the magic bullet or the the silver bullet. Is it a magic bullet? I don't know. It doesn't explain everything necessarily. We can't over rely on it to explain, how victims may be um, reluctant to participate in an investigation or prosecution, may feel like this isn't a place where they can achieve the justice that they're looking for. And so I want to kind of talk about these other aspects that make it so that victims may not be able to participate with us, because we want to make sure we're addressing and maybe trying to minimize some of these barriers as well.
Right. And that again underscores how important context is. There may be a need for resources. The victim may not have sufficient support. And the COVID-19 pandemic is a good example of that. Many victims lacked access to their usual support systems. Many victims were concerned about presenting for medical care due to fear of the transmission of the virus. The offender's threats: if you tell anyone, I'm going to kill you. If you tell anyone, I'm going to hurt you in other significant ways as well. Being concerned about the system, not understanding what we understand about the system and what we as prosecutors do with advocates and other allied professionals to support victims, but feeling there would be aloneness, if you will, in the system, that there would be no help, there would be no support. So that can certainly be a feature that mitigates against a victim's desire to participate. Witness tampering and intimidation, these are all different aspects of what may impact a victim in their, and I go back to that word, in their ability to make the decision to step forward after having suffered a horrible crime, to come forward to describe that to us, to allow us the opportunity to advance justice.
I'm just reflecting back on how you shared what victims had shared with you of this idea of stepping into the spotlight or the floodlights. I think about that as, as somebody is weighing the pros and cons of going forward, and this idea, and we don't even really have it here, maybe it's just fear, but who all is going to know about this? Like, I now have to tell all of my friends, all of my family, all of my coworkers. That in and of itself seems like so daunting. And I don't know if we understand what sometimes we're asking victim survivors, especially if we're not also then providing them the necessary support.
And another aspect of that, Jane, and we're all familiar with this as prosecutors, many victims feel like it's going to take forever to advance this case and to resolve this case. And in that process, we're asking them basically to put their lives on hold. They're awaiting justice, and that must be overwhelming to victims. And so it really obviates for those of us that are privileged to serve as prosecutors how important our due diligence is, trying to advance these cases as timely as possible, and making sure that we keep the victim's desire to complete the work on this case always right in front of us. I think that's so important also.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of highlight that we do have specific resources, and you, Patty, have been at the forefront of it, both in the delays and now potential backlogs that COVID-19 has presented itself, which is maybe exacerbating some of those feelings that victims feel like their life is on hold. And then additionally, you're doing a lot of work on the cold cases that are coming out of the sexual assault kit initiative, and those kits being tested after sometimes years and years, and how to engage with survivors who may be coming into it with this idea of like, hey, this system has already failed me. So how do you take this approach, this trauma-informed approach, when you're actually working with victims and survivors who have this as the reality that they've been working with for all of these years?
Well, it all begins with communication. And when we work with victims, survivors, we want to let them know that we recognize what their concerns are going to be. For example, to use a COVID-19 example, so many victims were concerned that even after offenders were arrested, that they would be released from custody because of the transmission of the virus. And so we knew this would be a concern, so we would anticipate that and ensure that we provided information about bail hearings and any potential release to a victim. We know that safety and security are critical to a victim, to their ability to maintain involvement in the work that we do in the criminal justice system. And that includes psychological safety as well as physical safety. So we need to be aware of the information that's so necessary for victims to plan. Recognizing trauma, as we've been discussing, is central to the work that we do. We need to be able to know trauma, to be able to connect with services and advocacy, and to really put together the kind of support that's so necessary for a victim. We all know that sexual assault isn't just a legal problem, an advocacy problem, a law enforcement problem, a social services problem. It's well beyond the components of all of these dimensions, and it's even more. And so the answer that really comes out so clearly is that it takes all of us working as a team to be in the best possible position to work with victim survivors and respond to their needs holistically.
I just want to touch on something because we talk about how important it is for us to recognize trauma so that we can see it in our cases and also formulate strategies to educate our judges and juries. But sometimes I think it's also really important for the victims to recognize trauma, that they may not understand some of the things that they're thinking, feeling, and some of the reactions that they have experienced. And
That's such a great point. Sorry, Jane.
no, I'm about to choke here. So yeah, follow.
No, and many victims are looking for the same answers that we're talking about. And working with advocates and other behavioral experts really gives us additional insight that we can share with victims. So it's so important that we benefit from the expertise of other allied professionals so that we can provide this kind of support to victims and perhaps provide guided answers to some of the questions that they're presenting to us.
And so that kind of takes me to the next area I want to talk about, which is, I know that my practice just really improved greatly once I started working really much more, intimately with our victim service providers and those that had been providing direct services to victims who could educate me on trauma and trauma responses. And now with the privilege of working with AEquitas, I have a lot more time to actually dive into some of the science behind it. But we talk about, how do we ask questions in a trauma-informed way, not only for us to get better information, but also to support the victim with just how we talk to them. And so I wanted to go through with you, as I'm sure I can imagine what a wonderful interviewer you would be. I would tell you anything, Patti. Some of what we talk about at AEquitas as this funnel approach.
Yes. And, it all begins with the openness and the communication that we bring into our conversations with victims. And they are actually conversations. And we need to be open to all of the information that victims are providing in a very non-judgmental way. What we're really receiving is trust from a victim when they somehow reach inside to provide the information that they are. There are various kinds of questions that we'll touch upon. They're open-ended questions that are really great because they allow the victim a real opportunity to provide the information that they're able to and that's most important to them. There are closed questions which may call for a very certain specific aspect of information. And generally, if we're going to ask a closed question, we're also going to follow up. And when we follow up with that question, we're again giving the victim more of an opportunity. I think we need to encourage narrative as much as possible, without the restraints of structures on questions, but give the victim an opportunity to ease into a discussion that we know is painful and difficult in the way that's best for them. And then as prosecutors, we can pick up on those cues and ask the appropriate questions without interrupting when it becomes necessary for us to do that.
Yeah, let's just go back to a couple things that you said because it's so important. And I may be like saying this in the face of prosecutors out there who are really very prepared and have a list of questions that they want to ask. And I'm going to say, that to me would not be a recipe for me to actually be listening to the answers. If I was just maybe thinking about the next question on my list. So I used to just have like areas that I wanted to explore. And I felt like that was really a much better way for me to make sure that I'm following the cues that the victim is giving me, that I'm actually listening and not interrupting. And then, but it's sometimes not as comfortable because you don't have everything planned to the T. And I know sometimes prosecutors are, big planners. I luckily never had that problem, but but that idea of, okay, we may have to follow their lead a little bit.
Right. And that's a great point. As prosecutors, we want to be very prepared professionals, and that's a great attribute for us to have. But we can prepare in advance so that when we're present in the interview, we're fully present. And we need to bear in mind that being present means not being distracted by other commitments, knowing that we have an engagement in court coming up in 30 minutes, knowing there are people waiting to see us in the hallway. We have to stay present in the moment. That's so important for victims, because if we're not present, victims will pick up on that in a heartbeat. And sometimes victims will interpret it that perhaps we're not believing what they're saying, or we're mistrusting what they're saying, or we don't view it as important as they do. And sexual assault is a life-altering event for victims. And the respect that we bring as prosecutors really compels us to be fully present in the moment for victims.
So I'm going to throw a question out at you, which we haven't really talked about yet, so maybe I'll surprise you. But what is your take on taking notes, especially like on a computer while you're conducting an interview?
I think the most important thing that we can do in an interview is to be fully present to the victim and communicate. My concern with taking notes, and most prosecutors do at some point, if we take notes, they have to be really abbreviated notes. We don't want to really take any attention away from the information that the victim is providing. If we turn to a computer, even if we have a laptop in front of us, we're not focused visually on the victim. We're not picking up on demeanor and behavioral cues. Maybe we're not recognizing the fear that is on the victim's face and in the victim's voice, because we're looking down or not looking straight ahead when we should. And I don't think we ever want to, as prosecutors, put ourselves in a position where we're concerned that we're not taking notes or doing things that we need to do to benefit our work on the case. But it's got to be done in such a way that it doesn't minimize our presence. So that would be my concern with taking notes on a computer.
I felt that as well, because there's so many non-verbal cues that cue us into maybe a trauma response. And if we're not also watching and looking, we may be really we may be missing some of that. I once had somebody give me a tip that if you were to take notes, because sometimes, if you don't take notes and then all of a sudden you write something down, that I know that if that was happening while somebody was interviewing me, I'd be like, okay, well, that was important. Why'd they write that down? What's going on?
Right. Exactly.
So the other tip was, if you are going to write notes, explain it in advance. the reason behind it, and maybe even offer, this person said they offer to, have somebody look at their notes at the end, feel free, I'll let you look at them when I'm done. They said nobody ever took them up on that, but that it somehow, kind of, alleviated some of that stress that they might be thinking about while they watch you take notes. So
Exactly.
a couple of tips there. So besides this funnel approach of asking the open and then the follow up and then the closed questions, the key being listening all the time. I know the other tip that we talk a lot about is this idea of relying on the fact that sensory memories are often heightened even in the course of a traumatic event. And to make sure that you're thinking about and formulating questions that might elicit sensory memories. So I thought maybe we could go through a couple of examples of what those types of questions might sound like.
Sure. And this is really a critical area for us because, first of all, it's trauma informed, and we're allowing the victim an opportunity to describe their experience of the crime in a way that is most applicable to what's happened to them. Secondly, this is information that ultimately is going to vastly improve our effectiveness at translating the reality of this crime for a jury. Juries truly connect with this kind of information. I can think of an example from a trial once where a victim testified about an offender holding his hand up to her throat. And I asked her, as she demonstrated this from the witness stand, how he held his hand up to her throat. Are you able to tell us how it felt as he held his hand in a way that you've described? In fact, you're showing us right now. And the victim's response was, it was like I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. Now, let's pause for a second to think about that, because we knew that his hand did not penetrate her neck, but this was a traumatized sense of touch. And I asked her then, as he held his hand up to your neck, as you've described, this is double and sometimes triple direct examination. Are you able to tell us how you felt, what you thought at that point? And the victim's response was, I felt like he was going to kill me, like I was going to die, which is the response of so many victims of sexual assault. And then the follow-up question is, did you sense anything else? Did you have any other feelings associated with this fear that you're describing to us? And the victim talked about a blackness, a darkness surrounding her, even though the lights were still on in the room, and how her heart was beating so fast it was almost like she couldn't breathe. Physiological effects as well. And so what we're doing is allowing the victim to describe in their own way their experience of the crime. And this is evidence that ultimately a jury is going to be able to connect with as well, accessing their senses, how they would feel if they were in a situation. And in that process, really developing an understanding of what happened to the victim, how trauma was inflicted by the offender.
I love that example. And if you think about all the senses, you really could come up with questions that might be, fact specific for your case. I'm thinking about a case where I don't think I intentionally drew it out, but something that ended up being one of those kind of goosebump moments was when the victim was describing the smell of the breath. It was that alcohol facilitates sexual assault, and the breath, and that's was the focus of sort of really all of her memory was, kind of this breath of this whiskey or whatnot. And I thought to myself, I know probably exactly what that smells like.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of that connection that you can make with the jury, because they're going to have that moment of maybe understanding as well, of like, I know what they're talking about when they say that particular smell or that particular taste. And then if you add on to that, your follow-up questions, these build upon questions, what are you able to remember? I'm able to remember the smell. Okay, how did you feel? What did you think? I just wanted it to end. And I just thought, how can it get this to end as quickly as possible? How did that affect you? Well, I just remained still and I couldn't move. Like you could kind of see how this builds upon one another if you start with those those sensory questions.
Yeah, those are great examples, Jane. And I want to share one more, the sense of sight. I've had victims testify that offenders filled up the doorway, and the offender did not turn out to be very tall or even very buff. But that is the fear incipient upon seeing someone invading a boundary, creating an even larger persona, a traumatized sense of sight. So many victims also will describe their experience of the offender's eyes as the offender approaches the victim in the sexual assault. I've heard many different descriptions: mean, ugly, angry, violent, hateful, fearful. And it's really compelling testimony. And I really wanted to mention how this engages a jury as well. I can recall jurors once in a case where the victim was testifying as to how the offender's eyes looked as he came toward her. And she had been in a relationship previously, and they had had arguments. She had seen his eyes in many different scenarios, but in this time it was something different, and she was terrified. And I noticed as she was testifying, some of the members of the jury were kind of looking over toward where the defendant was seated, trying to see his eyes and what his eyes were like then. So this can also be compelling testimony on direct examination at trial as well. And it very much engages jurors in the work that we're doing in the testimony that's being presented.
Absolutely. And we've been modeling this really well, but we haven't said it explicitly, which is the magic word of able. And maybe you guys out there listening have picked up on it. But it is a magic word. It does so much by phrasing it this way. I don't know, Pat, if you want to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I do. I love this word too, Jane. I mean, because what it really is, it is the infrastructure of trauma, and it can communicate so much beyond just the simple articulation of able. When, as prosecutors, we say to a victim, "What are you able to tell us about what happened?" What we're also saying, without having to put it into words, we know that you've been traumatized. We know this is a horrifying crime that you've suffered, and we understand that it may be tough or it may be very difficult to articulate your experience of the crime. We're saying all of those by simply saying, "What are you able to tell us?" And the other thing that we do by using that word, we take the pressure, the burden off of the victim's shoulders, simply to tell us what you're able to. There's no other expectation but that, and that certainly it's the truth. So the word really is magic. It's invaluable for us as prosecutors, for law enforcement professionals, for medical professionals, even for advocates as well. It is such a victim-centered word.
And as we are sort of conveying that to the victim when we're asking the question, I think we're also conveying it to the jury. Like the jury is also hearing that and going, "Oh, well, maybe my expectations should also be here," or maybe this is because of trauma. I feel like we're really doing a good job of communicating that to them as well.
That's great. That's a really great point, Jane.
Okay, so we've done all this great work. We've been trauma informed, we've connected with services, but ultimately, I think we've all had the experience where a victim survivor is really just unable to participate in the prosecution for any number of reasons that we've sort of discussed. So how do we as prosecutors analyze and consider and balance what our roles and responsibilities are?
Well, first and foremost, our commitment is to victims and to their self-determination. That's so important. But also we're going to engage in balancing. We have responsibilities to our communities that are so serious. We have a responsibility to ensure public safety and the protection of people in our community, and we certainly don't want to have further victimization to occurring. Obviously, we're very concerned about the victim that we're working with, but we also know that victims have rights as well, the right to self-determination and the right to autonomy. Hopefully, what we're doing in our work as prosecutors, we're building evidentiary strong cases, evidence-based cases. And so as we do that, we're putting ourselves in the best possible position if a victim is unable to proceed with us, if we have the duty to proceed anyway. But we certainly want to respect a victim's wishes. That's critical to who we are as trauma-informed prosecutors. Justice may be different in one case than it is in another case. And prioritizing a victim's safety, that is a paramount consideration. We don't want to expose any victim to danger that we're not going to be able to protect them from. So we clearly have to consider this as well. If an offender is threatening a victim, then we might be able to employ forfeiture by wrongdoing and be able to admit a victim's prior testimony if we meet the criterion in our jurisdiction and under our case law. Very often, we'll ask for the assistance of expert witnesses who are able to explain various responses to trauma so that a jury can better understand them. And then, again, Jane had mentioned the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. Thanks to that work that's being done throughout the country, we've learned a great deal about serial perpetration and the significant incidence of serial or repeat offenders in both categories of offenders who are known to victims as well as unknown. And, we've even learned that there's crossover offending, which tells us even more about danger, the danger to the victim that we're working with and the danger to other members of our community. So these are a few of the very important considerations that are going to help guide us as we use our prosecutorial discretion and try to meet the needs of the victim in a balanced way.
Mm-hmm. I think just as we started by saying that trauma impacts victims in very individualized ways, we can bookend that and talk about how our work is also necessarily individualized, case by case, facts by facts, and victim circumstances by victim circumstances. But to have these other tools in our toolbox is always a really great position to be in if we can hold offenders accountable, especially knowing what we know about serial perpetration. We can hold them accountable in an evidence-based prosecution or in other ways that we can achieve that level of balance and justice. Okay, Patti, well, this has been great. I think we've got a couple of takeaways, which is really to understand how offenders inflict and compound a victim's trauma, and always having an incumbent upon ourselves to look back towards and to frame things in that offender-focused way. Support victims by their engagement with our system by minimizing those barriers that we've identified. Listen to them about their own concerns. I love how you said psychological safety as well as physical safety, and what can we do holistically with our allied professional partners to support victims. And then leverage the law enforcement expertise, leverage our other experts to make sure that when we're at trial and we're preparing for trial, we can put forth this evidence of trauma and conduct trauma-informed direct examinations. So I think all of the, much of these additional resources and the work that AEquitas has and resources available to all of you guys, a lot of it you'll notice Patti Powers predominantly there as an author or a presenter. I'd really encourage folks to look out for our SAKI or Sexual Assault Kit Initiative resources directly through our website or through their own website as well. And then Patti, I know you're really involved in our office hours, so I thought I'd give you an opportunity to plug those.
Yes, we would really invite you to join us for office hours. We hold it the third Thursday of every month from 2 to 4 Eastern. And we really encourage a national conversation with us as well as your peers who are able to join these calls. We have guest presenters who will come in and talk about cutting edge topics. And then we all have an opportunity to talk about our experience in our own jurisdiction and really bring our expertise to the attention of others, as well as obtaining information from our peers who are also doing this work. So please do join us. We'd love it.
I heard your partner in crime on these, John Curlin, he discussed it as a national virtual lunchroom where you can talk to your peers and soundboard as you would if you were in your office and walk down the hall into a lunchroom and said, hey, guess what happened this morning in court? What a really great opportunity to do that. No need to reinvent the wheel, and always good to kind of look outside of your own office to see if there are other practices that you could employ. So that's pretty cool. This is my contact information. This is Patty's. I'm going to leave it to you to say your parting words, but I'll just thank everyone for listening today.
Well, thank you, Jane, for the opportunity of having this conversation. And thanks to all of you who are participating and listening to this conversation. One of the highest callings that we have as prosecutors is to be trauma informed. What we do for victims when we are trauma informed is something they will never forget, that's invaluable to them as they try to process their way through serious violent crimes such as sexual assault. And what we do as prosecutors who are trauma informed, we help bring justice to victims by supporting them through this process, by recognizing what their experience is, and ultimately by conveying this reality of the crime to a jury. Thanks again, Jane.
Thanks, Patty.